Hello and welcome to Bud's RPG Review, where I give my thoughts on role-playing games, card games and board games. Welcome to part 6 of my review of Masks of Nyarlathotep for Call of Cthulhu 7th edition by Chaosium. This video will be in 2 parts. The first one will be the initial investigations in Egypt, finishing with the Egyptian Museum, and the second video will begin with the Shrine to Bast and cover the Carlisle Expedition, the Resurrection of Nitocris and the chapter climax. It begins with the explanation that the Egypt chapter is a pivot point for the campaign and offers much in the way of things to do. It explains that the Egyptian arm of the Brotherhood are very powerful and that the chapter should not be taken lightly, and it could also be the first time that they have visited somewhere truly foreign, with language and cultural barriers being obvious real-world obstacles, though if one of the investigators are of Arabic or Egyptian descent, this should be somewhat mitigated, or if they are scholars of Egyptian or Arabic culture and history. It describes Egypt as a land of extremes, things like the temperature, smells, noise, maze of streets and extremes of richness and poverty, alongside the sheer mass and bustle of people that are here. It even suggests getting hold of a modern guidebook, as this could help set the scene, as well as an Arabic phrasebook. We then move on to picking up the trail. After New York, they should have enough to attract them into visiting Egypt, as well as the information from England, but it notes that some of the information may be redundant if they've done China, Kenya or Australia first, or spoken to Jack Brady. The main reason it suggests for going to Cairo is because the Carlisle Expedition visited there. The London chapter does provide the bulk of the clues for Cairo as listed here, mentioning in particular the Black Pharaoh memorabilia in Penhu's collection. It gives us a map of Cairo with all of the pertinent places marked out, and then continues to list the rest of the clues that lead you here, as well as detailing how to approach the chapter if they've been to other places first, and who they will be most likely to seek out when they arrive. It also mentions that there is only one sidetrack scenario, the Black Cat. We then move on to the Carlisle Expedition. Warren Bessart welcomed the expedition in 1919, and after a brief settling in, they met with Omar al-Shakti, in which they returned the crown of Nitocris, which had been taken from Pharaoh's Najjar. This was a goodwill gesture and used to cement their working relationship. With this settled, the expedition set off for Giza to search for 3rd Dynasty artefacts, and by the end of the month, Carlisle was settled in Dashur, which was the main objective of his mission. He then proceeded to climb the Red Pyramid and smash the protective ward in the capstone, which Jack Brady witnessed. This cleared the path for Houston, Masters, Penhu and himself to enter Nyarlathotep's inner sanctum within the Bent Pyramid and vanish back to Egypt's past to learn the secrets of its insane scheme. During this time, Masters fell pregnant to the crawling chaos. Upon their return, a sacrificial event was organised in the deserts near the collapsed pyramid at Maydam, which irritated al-Shakti. This ritual slaughter was witnessed by Jack Brady and Warren Bessart. After this, they wrapped up the dig at Dashur and planned their trip to the mountains of the Black Wind in Kenya. Their entire stay in Egypt lasted only 2.5 months. The next thread that they may feel inclined to follow is what Jackson Elias did here. He arrived in November 1924 from Shanghai, having spoken to Jack Brady, though asking around about him will produce very few sightings of him. The owner of the Cairo Bulletin, Nigel Wasif, can put them in the right direction, as can Dr. Ali Kaffour, who is a good man to know with regard to the occult aspects of the Egyptian chapter, added to the fact that he was the only one who actually spoke to Jackson. More on those later. It then moves on how to run this chapter. It again presents us with the London Underground-esque map of how the clues fit together, which may or may not be useful, and then moves on to discussing the key threats in Egypt. The main ones are presented by the Brotherhood of the Black Pharaoh, most notably in Omar al-Shakti, and his plan to resurrect the ancient Egyptian queen Nitocris. The investigators can also face Nyarlathotep himself in his Mask of the Black Pharaoh should they end up inside the throne room of the Bent Pyramid. Elias's clues could lead them to Pharaoh's Najjar and Warren Bessart, who can provide more information to go forward with. The sidetrack scenario, the Black Cat, involves Jan Willem van Hoevelen, an ex-member of the Carlisle Expedition, and valuable information can be gleaned from this encounter. Any investigators that survive the chapter should know the outcome of the machinations of the crawling chaos, and possibly even what to do to stop it. It gives us the usual list of pulp considerations and then moves on to the first part, arriving in Egypt. Usually, in the past, the Cairo chapter has classically followed the London chapter, and the easiest way to get there in the 1920s is by sea, docking at either Port Said or Alexandria. There is also the possibility of taking the ferry from Dover to Calais and taking the blue train to Marseille and then the steamer to Alexandria. Upon arriving in Cairo, the steamers are mobbed by a flotilla of smaller vessels that are touting for business in some fashion, whether that be water taxis, tourist services or hotels, and once they actually set foot on the land, it doesn't get much better, with them being jostled by various criminal types looking to separate them from their valuables, as well as dragomen or tourist guides. It gives us some information on the route the investigators could take should they not want to travel by sea, though this is much rougher and time consuming. Also, it lets us know how to get to Cairo from America, Nairobi, China and Australia, should their approach be from these places. We have a small bit of information on the legal tender of the time, the Egyptian pound, and then we move on to how they enter the country. They need to obtain visas upon entering Egypt, then again at Cairo, with both requiring valid passports. If they try to bring firearms into the country, it will require a look roll or they will be discovered and confiscated unless a permit is arranged at the port of entry. After this, they need to catch a train to Cairo itself. This should take around a day or two to do, and there are the usual class denominations on board. Once in Cairo, they can use motor taxis or horse-drawn carriages to get about the city, though braver investigators may want to use the tram network. Walking is a viable, though not necessarily safe option too. Investigators will see the advantage of booking ahead when they have to carry their luggage with them at every step, given the general bustle and criminal types waiting to prey on hapless foreign tourists. It then goes into the setting information for Cairo at this time. It covers the opening of the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922 and the attention that was lavished upon Cairo by the rest of the world as a result. It also discusses the rich cultural heritage of Egypt stretching as far back as 5,000 years ago. We then move on to the current state of Egypt in 1925. It was a time of turmoil, with the British Protectorate coming up to its 40th year following its revolution in 1919, led by Sag Zaghloul. It's largely independent, with the British reserving certain areas concerning imperial communications, the Sudan, the defence of Egypt and the Suez Canal, and the protection of foreign interests and minorities. This presence is the cause of civil unrest, with Cairo being a powder keg of political intrigue. Britain's interference prompts resentment to foreigners in general. The movement of ancient artefacts from Egypt by foreign archaeologists is of particular sensitivity, which could prove difficult for the investigators should they want to export mythos items, and they could go to prison if they are caught trying to edge out the law. As you may imagine, there is a thriving black market for trade licenses. We then move on to El Kahiri itself. Despite the political unrest in Cairo, it does retain a certain allure, being the city of the Arabian Nights that has a juggler and a snake charmer on every street corner. It talks about Ezekiel Gardens that sits within the city and is the hub of European expat life with its cafes, shops and nightlife. It then moves on to the old city, the kind of thing most would imagine with narrow mazes of alleys, marketplaces and the like. It talks about the Muski, the famous bazaar where exotic things such as silk, spices and rugs can be bought, as well as black market items if you know where to look. The Old Quarter is also the hub of the classic Arabic architecture associated with Cairo, with 2- and 4-storey buildings that are made from mud brick and tile and are whitewashed. It discusses the east bank of the Nile, which has Casa el Dubara, the Garden City, where most of the palaces and government buildings are, as well as expensive houses and flats. To the south of the city is the citadel of Saladin, near the eerie, bleak, windswept wilderness of the City of the Dead, a place of tombs and mausoleums. We have a note on street names, pointing out that some are in Arabic and others are in English, such as the Street of Jackals. It then moves on to the poverty that the investigators will encounter. In Cairo, poverty is endemic, with beggars everywhere. Of course, some of these will be con artists, but many of these beggars suffer with genuine physical deformities. A particular waterborne parasitic disease, schistosomiasis, that causes a swollen belly is everywhere. Beggars, however, do see a lot on the street and will provide information to those generous with their cash. It stresses that getting around Cairo is mostly on foot due to the narrow, crowded streets, though it does point out that there is an excellent tram system in place. Next it moves on to communication. Dialect-wise, Coptic has been replaced with Arabic, with the exception being the Berik dialect, which is used for religious purposes. Many people speak English, though Arabic is the majority language. French holds a place in the likes of museums and learned societies. Religion-wise, Egypt is predominantly Islamic, though Coptic Christianity does also exist, and committing offences against local customs is a real possibility, as well as rude and intolerant investigators. Weather-wise, it is hottest in June to August at well over 37 degrees. Winter is cooler, though rainfall is erratic, and Kamsin, or dust storms, happen between March and June. The stifling heat has in-game effects listed here in the too hot to handle section, which covers the likes of dehydration and heat stroke. Following this, we move on to the scenario proper with the Brotherhood of the Black Pharaoh. This is considered the central branch of the cult with over 300 members. Most of its people are Egyptian nationals, though people from many parts of the world are also members, and the high priest is Omar al-Shakti. They hold their rituals in the desert, in caverns underneath the Sphinx, and occasionally near the Dashur pyramids, though they stay well hidden from the authorities. They are known to use short swords, daggers, garrots, and the short spiked club associated with the cult. The authorities, of course, deny the existence of the cult, though they do know of it and are under orders not to discuss it, as it would reflect incredibly badly if news broke of a murder cult in Cairo. After this, we move on to the dramatis personae of the chapter. I'll go into these people more when we reach their relevant section in the book, but I will provide a quick overview here. First, it talks about the Allies and independence. It has antiquities dealer Faraz Najjar, a man who has found himself on the wrong side of the Brotherhood. Warren Bassart, a near-mad hashish addict who is a former associate of the Carlisle Expedition. Nigel Wasif, the proprietor of the Cairo Bulletin and undercover agent of England. Dr. Ali Kaffour, an occult curator and ritual magician who the party can gain information and aid from. Ahmed al-Dahabi, a learned Islamic scholar who resides in the Ibn Tulun Asylum who protects the girdle of Nitocris, and Dr. Emile Vabreau, a police forensics expert. After this we have the Clive Expedition. First up is Dr. Henry Clive, an archaeologist, cultist and sorcerer. Martin Winfield, an archaeologist, cultist and sadist who is a well-connected son of a member of the British Parliament. Agatha Broadmoor, a psychic medium and potential ally. James Gardner, an archaeologist, potential ally and author. And Johanna Specht, an archaeologist and mystic who has the amazing ability to sight-read hieroglyphics. Lastly, we move on to the adversaries. First and foremost is Omar al-Shakti, a wealthy plantation owner and high priest of the Brotherhood of the Black Pharaoh. Sharifa Rawash, the revivified Queen Nitocris of ancient Egypt, and also details two minor NPCs, Nuri of El Wasta, the guardian of the Eye of Light and Darkness, and Nessa Mefti, the bearer of the Sword of Akmala, also a potential ally. Okay, so now we've set the scene and we move on to the first section, the Mother of Cities. It gives us an optional scene called Fresh Off the Boat. If they book ahead, then this scene is irrelevant. It involves them being met as they step off by a man who talks in virtually flawless English, who introduces himself as Ibi Musa, who suggests the Hotel du Sud as a place for them to stay. Before they can answer, he motions for a gaggle of urchins to grab their bags and then immediately sets off through the crowds. This whole scene is treated like a chase sequence, and the crush of bodies makes it all the more difficult. Should they manage to follow Ibi, they eventually arrive at the Hotel du Sud, where, perhaps surprisingly, their bags have arrived safely. The Hotel du Sud has, sadly, seen better days. The paint is peeling and the curtains faded and the whole thing looks like it was fashionable 40 years ago. The proprietor is Madame Patenot, a middle-aged woman of faded elegance. If they decide to stay at the hotel, they will have rooms that are not only not close together, but also on different floors. They are tired-looking and very basic. If they're smart enough to search the rooms for anything untoward, they discover sliding panels in the back of each wardrobe that lead to vacant rooms next door. If, of course, they don't bother doing this, small items will start vanishing while they are out and about or asleep. They can, of course, lay in wait for the would-be thieves, and it ultimately becomes clear that Madame Patenot is in on the matter. After this, we have the many shops of Faraz Najjar. They are led here by clues left by Jackson Elias, and can find out that Najjar had a shop in the Street of Jackals in the Old City. Finding it is not easy, as there are no complete maps for Cairo at this time, though hiring a competent dragoman will make things much easier. They should eventually find the street, however, they quickly learn that Najjar's shop is a pile of burned out rubble in a hole in the ground. The locals will invoke Allah every time they pass the spot, and doing a bit of digging locally will reveal that around 5 to 6 years earlier, a demon descended on the shop and burned it to the ground. This is surprisingly true. The Brotherhood has summoned a fire vampire as punishment to Najjar for stealing cult artefacts and selling them to Roger Carlisle. The police can confirm that a fire happened, but will rubbish any talk of demons, saying it was caused by an oil lamp, with the local news of the time backing up the police version of events. If the investigators question the locals, they can discover that Najjar survived the fire but was horribly disfigured, and now has a new shop in the Khan al-Khalili, though it will require a modicum of generosity to pry out this information. He is generally spoken of in hushed tones as the locals believe he is cursed. It then moves on to the Street of Potters, where Najjar's new shop is. They find it with a sign that says Faraz Najjar in Arabic, Curios in English, and Magazine d'Antiquités in French. Inside they find Najjar. He begins talking to them with a gracious nature, which will instantly change should the Carlisle Expedition be mentioned, causing him to shoo them out of the shop, locking up behind them. He will get aggressive should they refuse to leave. Someone with the right speech skills can calm him down, and he will invite them to the nearby Al-Hussein Mosque to talk. Unfortunately for the investigators, he is more scared of the Brotherhood than anything else, causing any intimidation to fail automatically. It gives a number of alternative ways that they could speak to Najjar, and then moves on to a piece on the dragoman, explaining their usefulness and giving a few examples for the keeper to use, and then moves on to Najjar's tale. At the mosque, he will meet them in a small room, saying he feels safest on sacred ground. He explains that Carlisle sought information on the Black Pharaoh, with Najjar coming into possession of a few items related to him. He offered them to Carlisle via Warren Bassart. One of the items was an ancient scroll detailing an entrance to a hidden room in an unnamed pyramid where the Black Pharaoh was supposedly entombed. A bust of the Black Pharaoh, which is in Gavigan's secret room in Essex, a small tambour drum with mystical symbols on it, and a strange circlet set with a large zircon, supposedly the Black Pharaoh's crown. This is actually the circlet of Nitocris, though Najjar is none the wiser. Pressing him further with the right roles gets him to admit that he stole these items from the home of Omar al-Shakti, who he later discovered was High Priest of the Brotherhood. Though he tries to stay away from anything to do with the Brotherhood, he has heard fresh rumours that they were involved in a recent theft of a mummy from the Clive Expedition, and that they also want an item that is in the Mosque of Ibn Tulun, though he doesn't know what it is or why. Should they press him on occult matters, he suggests speaking to a wise woman called Nuri, who lives in the nearby town of El Wasta. The next section is called The Fallen Agent, and it deals with Carlisle's former agent, Warren Bassart. He can be tracked down to a place called the Red Alley in the Street of Scorpions in the Old City, though getting this information from the police will be tricky. Should they track down the Red Alley, they will find a clothing shop owned by Abu Udare, who will deny Basart is there, though he can easily be caught in a lie. Should the investigators manage to find Basart, perhaps by staking out the shop, they will see a strange muffled figure leave the shop at around 8 PM. Unfortunately, due to him being functionally insane, he's difficult to confront. Only a successful intimidate will stop him turning and running away. This obviously triggers a chase sequence, though they should eventually be able to catch up with him. His home is a filthy bed in a tiny room of the shop. He has wild eyes and is a wreck of a man. When talking, he lapses between English, French and Arabic, speaking in empty, emotionless tones. He is a hashish addict and will occasionally forget what he is saying in mid-conversation. His tale will come across as far-fetched, though he will explain what he saw in the desert. It was during the climax of an orgiastic ritual that he saw the Black Sphinx, a terrifying entity of great power. This sapped the last of his sanity, and his final memory of the desert was an army of sphinxes. It points out that Jack Brady does not mention the Black Sphinx in his report of the same event, as he had fled the area before it had made an appearance. He will, if pushed, remember an old woman who tried to warn him, and will eventually say that it was Nuri from El-Wasta. Having hopefully spoken to Faraz Najjar and or Warren Basart, the investigators should wish to question Nuri. El-Wasta is a few hours up the Nile, and due to the lack of visitors, it's unlikely that English is spoken, so a dragoman or translator will be needed. When they arrive there, they find a town with lots of Nuris, and without a systematic approach it will take a luck roll to find the right one. Asking questions around town can determine that the right Nuri once had foreign guests a few years ago. They eventually come across her tiny hovel, though the Brotherhood has at this stage been made aware of their activities and may be waiting for them. They first come across Ubaid, Nuri's son, who is missing the right side of his face, arm and shoulder. They look to have been gouged off. He has halting speech and is wary of them, though if they persist he will take them to his mother. Upon meeting Nuri, they will realise how old she looks, though her injuries make her age indeterminate. She's normally insane, but upon seeing the investigators her eyes will light up. She starts making gurgling noises and pointing with the stumps of her hands to the corner of the hut. His son will rush to her aid and will bring something from one corner of the room to them. There is a rush basket painted with a red symbol that those with the right knowledge skills can identify as an ancient Egyptian glyph of protection. Within the basket is a 7 by 9 inch slab of white stone that looks like it was broken from a larger piece. It has a strange symbol etched on it that looks similar to the Eye of Horus. Nuri will silently plead with them to take it, and if, when they accept, she will then lapse into dullness, her last goal fulfilled. Studying the stone indicates that it is many centuries old and looks like the facing from an old pyramid. Under daylight it can be seen to have a pinkish hue, similar to that of the Red Pyramid at Dashur. The other half of the stone is in Jack Brady's possession. It's one half of the Eye of Light and Darkness that was broken by Roger Carlisle. The ritual of activating it can be learned from the 7 cryptical books of Hassan, though Dr. Ali Kaffour may be able to recognise it. More on him later. Also, Old Bundari and Kenya can give them information when they eventually meet him. The next section details the Cairo Bulletin. It suggests putting this conveniently close to wherever the investigators are staying, and they can learn that it can provide them information on the Carlisle Expedition while they were in Egypt. As far as they can tell, it was the only newspaper that was visited by Jackson Elias, indicating that it had some importance. They can find out information on the Carlisle Expedition, the Clive Expedition, and the fire in the Street of Jackals from either the paper's archives or its proprietor Nigel Wasif. They can gain access to the archives here, with several articles of varying usefulness, including some candid photos of the expedition leads leaving various important places, as well as finding out exact dates of things like the arrival, the excavations, etc. If they look to question Wasif on the matter, he will remember how horrible the expedition was, as they kept the press away from their dealings, and can recall that they had several dinners with Omar al-Shakti, a wealthy local cotton plantation owner. If the investigators ingratiate themselves with Wasif by being steadfast friends and allies, he will confide in them that he knows al-Shakti is connected to the Brotherhood of the Black Pharaoh, something he believed brings great shame to Egypt. With regard to the Clive expedition, he can advise them that it is currently in Egypt, excavating at Giza, and that they have recently found a female mummy of unknown origin from a secret room in Mycerius' pyramid. He will remark that there is a rumour that the mummy is Queen Nitocris, a mysterious figure from the 6th dynasty. Strangely, before this could be proven, it was stolen, sarcophagus and all, leaving all concerned bewildered, as the site was well guarded and there was only one entrance to the chamber. He will also tell them of the Dutch archaeologist Jan Willem van Huvelen, who was fired for incompetence and is said to be holed up in Cairo somewhere as he couldn't afford a return ticket home. After this we have the Egyptian Museum. Containing a staggering collection of Egyptian antiquities, the museum is not far from the Nile and the Khazar al-Nil Bridge and its ochre dome is a landmark in the city. It's open 9 AM till 4 PM. It has a huge collection of regional cult materials, including a copy of the Al-Azif should they dig far enough. The resident expert here is Dr. Ali Kafur, whose interest will be piqued if they ask about Jackson Elias, the Carlisle Expedition or the Black Pharaoh, though he doesn't suffer fools lightly. Should the players bypass the Cairo Bulletin entirely, there are other ways of encountering Dr. Kafur, and those investigators who are Egyptologists or occultists may have actually already heard of him on a professional basis. What was described as the core of the Egyptian museum is its collection in the vaults, encased in steel a foot thick to guard from Nile water intrusion and sealed with German locks. Unknown to anyone, Dr. Kafur has placed a powerful warding spell on the entire collection, the Seal of Isis. More on that in Appendix C in Book 2. Should they manage to get Dr. Kafur on side, he can offer them many insights. He's a kindly scholar in possession of some important knowledge. If they mention Jackson Elias to them, he will remember him well. He was nervous, driven and seemed paranoid. He wanted to know about the Carlisle Expedition. Unfortunately, Dr. Kafur had another meeting to attend, and by the time he got round to fully addressing his queries, Elias had gone. He'll be shocked and saddened to hear of his death, and will warn the investigators that they are stepping in the way of great danger. The Doctor can also tell him about the Black Pharaoh in historical terms. He will tell them at the end of the 3rd dynasty, Neferenka came to Egypt and was a powerful sorcerer who brought madness and death to his enemies with ease. He was said to come from the city of pillars in the desert of Arabia. Neferenka revived worship of an ancient foul god, the Black Pharaoh, and over time they seemed to merge into one entity. He fought with Zosa's successors for the control of the land, and for a while the Black Pharaoh ruled the land. Eventually Sneferu rose and founded the 4th dynasty with the aid of the goddess Isis, and thwarted and slew Neferenka. For some reason, a pyramid was built in Meidum to contain Neferenka's body, though Dr. Kafur speculates that the pyramid in some way insulated Egypt from the foul magic within. Unfortunately, the Meidum pyramid collapsed and a second nearby was hurriedly repurposed. This was the Bent pyramid at Dashur. The records show that Neferenka's corpse was reinterred there, but it has to date not been found. Sneferu ordered all traces of the Black Pharaoh removed from the land, though his worshippers remained scheming until they were driven from the land. During the 6th dynasty, the cruel Queen Nitocris was said to be in league with the new cult of the Black Pharaoh, though proof has been deemed subjective. Dr. Kafur will casually mention that sometimes the Black Pharaoh is called Nyarlathotep instead. He can also tell the investigators some of the legends surrounding the Black Pharaoh. He is said to have possessed a huge beast that the Sphinx at Giza is said to be modelled on, and that this creature had an important function in rituals led by Queen Nitocris. His voice was said to carry throughout the land upon a black wind. A prophecy says that he will rise again, fingers and toes after the Great Good One. This is said to mean 20 centuries after Jesus, and will usher in a new age for the Black Pharaoh's followers. Man-like creatures are said to lurk underground in the desert who worship the Black Pharaoh. Dr. Kafur truly believes that the Black Pharaoh and Queen Nitocris existed, and that he was part of a pantheon called the Outer Gods, led by the demon sultan Azathoth. He claims to have seen the man-like servitors in the desert, and knows as fact that the Brotherhood of the Black Pharaoh exists to this day, slowly growing in power and influence, mentioning the cult of the Bloody Tongue in Kenya who worship an aspect of the Black Pharaoh. Dr. Kafur also believes that the mummy stolen recently from the Carlisle Expedition was the remains of Queen Nitocris, and he speculates that this relates to the prophesied return of the Black Pharaoh. He will also mention Jan Willem van Huvelen being let go by the expedition. With regard to the Penhew Foundation, he will mention that he always had respect for Sir Aubrey and Edward Gavigan. Okay, that concludes part 1 of Egypt. The next video in this series will be the second half of this chapter.